Oh, it's sticky.
Would you want to live totally on your own, or would you want a like a roommate?
There's nothing quite like the bond between brothers and sisters. And in families like mine, when you have a sibling with an intellectual disability, that bond can take on additional meaning.
So tell me what it was like to grow up in a family with 3 sisters.
It was fun. We always laugh. We sometimes like to bicker a lot. Except I grew out of that. I love my sisters.
I think until the age of 5, I don't think my triplet sisters and I were really aware of the fact that Gabrielle had Down syndrome. When I was in 1st grade, we were asked to bring in an item for show and tell, and most of my friends brought in a Cabbage Patch doll or a G.I. Joe figure. I brought in my sister Gabrielle. And it's interesting because somehow I knew at such an early age, at 6 years old, that I wanted to show my peers that Gabrielle was no different than any of them and that there's nothing to be afraid of.
Okay. Take care.
Even though I've always treated Gabrielle the same as everybody else, it's like the rest of the world is still catching up. Whenever I stop to think about this disconnect, one word keeps popping in my head. So growing up with a sister with Down syndrome definitely made me and my triplet sisters that much more sensitive to specific language that surrounded people with intellectual disabilities. And none more passionately than the word retard or retarded.
It's okay. How often do you hear the word retard or retarded?
I hear the word retarded pretty often.
Pretty often.
Quite often from where we're from. Pretty often.
I hear it quite often, actually.
Far too often.
I don't know, a couple times a week.
A few times a week.
I'd say about 4 times a week, 5 times a week.
Probably at least once a day.
Like daily or probably a couple of times?
Maybe 3 times a day? Probably 10 times a day.
I hear it all the time.
Since it appears as though other people are hearing the R word as often as I am, it led me to wonder how a word once used as a medical term became a derogatory word used to put people down. And could language, or more specifically, this one word, be contributing to why people like my sister still seem to be so misunderstood? For most of human history, society has struggled to understand people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. What made them the way they are? How do we treat them? What do we call them? A long time ago, during the periods of antiquity and the Middle and early modern ages, intelligence, beauty, and strength were especially valued characteristics. So those individuals with disabilities were frequently cast off from society, often living in extreme poverty, left to die, or even killed. Words like idiocy, idiot, and fool were used to express the inferior status of this population. As the world became more industrialized, the time period gave rise to the eugenics movement, a pseudoscience that endeavored to maintain the integrity of the human race. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities were seen as a threat to society and its gene pool. So efforts were made to segregate them as inmates at institutions across the United States, restricted their right to marry, and enforced involuntary sterilization. These inhumane practices continued well into the latter part of the 20th century. The language associated with disability also changed. With the advent of IQ testing, individuals with intellectual disabilities were classified as idiots, imbeciles, or morons depending on their reported IQ score. Around the 1950s, mental retardation became the accepted medical and colloquial terminology, as idiot, imbecile, and moron took on the stigma associated with this community. Eventually, the term mental retardation was also stigmatized, as it evolved into the popular slang put-downs retard and retarded, which became commonplace epithets in American neighborhoods, schoolyards, and adult life.